Well, continuing with level 1 macroeconomics, we've got a reading on understanding business cycles. There's about 10 learning outcome statements in this. We'll start off describing business cycles. We've got some definitions regarding unemployment, employment, who's looking for work, who's not looking for work, which you just need to memorize. We've got some leading and lagging indicators that we want to look at to see if we can tell where an economy is in the business cycle by the various economic indicators that are available to us. And then we've got one kind of tough LOS on what are the different theories of business cycles, but we'll distill that down a little bit. So let's start off just describing the business cycle. You'll see from this slide, if I can get it up for you, that the economy cycles around an average or trend line, and sometimes it's above trend, reaching peaks of economic activity and employment, leading to inflation. And sometimes we have troughs, bottom of recessions, where inflation is lower, employment is lower, and of course GDP growth and economic activity are lower as well. So we move from trough to peak through an expansionary phase, and peak to trough through a contraction of the economy or a recessionary phase. Now the thing to look at here around this trend line is that the length of these, the periods, are not as predictable as this graph would suggest. Sometimes recessions are longer, sometimes they're shorter, same thing with expansions. And also the amplitude, how far these are deviating from the trend line. There's no real predictability there too. Some expansions really go on and to high levels, and some stop earlier and peak and turn the other way. So the amplitude and the periods of this are not predictable. But what we do know is historically is that these economies, market-based economies, move through these business cycles. So the only thing predictable is that we will reach a peak, and after that we will reach a trough, and that expansions are often followed by recessions and vice versa. So let's take a look at what happens to a couple of things as we move through these business cycles. And first thing we want to look at is the inventory to sales ratio. Now this is all driven by sales. So early in a contraction, sales slow, the denominator goes down, and inventory sales ratios go up. And then early in an expansion, when sales increase unexpectedly, this draws down inventories, so the inventory sales ratio decrease to below normal levels. Well, these are going to be the signals that businesses take to plan their future production, right? So early in an expansion, we have unexpectedly increased sales. This draws down inventories. Well, companies are going to respond to this by increasing production after that. And same with contractions. Now, let's look at also labor and capital utilization. And what's running this relationship here is right here. Firms are slow to hire and to lay off employees. Now, there's costs to hiring and laying off full-time employees, and firms don't like to do it. So what we see is at the beginning of a contraction, rather than laying people off, they may cut some hours, they may cut temporary laborers, but labor and capital overall are going to be used less intensively. And at the beginning of an expansion, we're going to have an increase in intensity prior to the increase in hiring. So similar to what we talked about with inventory sales, there's a lag here at the turning points of the business cycle. Now, if these trends persist over time, then firms will adjust labor, and they will adjust their physical capital, their productive assets over time in response to these changes. Now we want to look at the housing sector and the external trade sector as required by our learning outcome statement. And housing sector is a highly cyclical sector of the economy. Activities determined by mortgage rates, rates up, housing purchases down because monthly payments are higher. When incomes are up, okay, or the ratio of incomes to housing costs are up, then that drives housing activity higher. Not hard to understand why that is. When people have better incomes in relation to housing prices, and especially when they perceive a fairly secure future, at least over a couple of years or so, that's when people feel more comfortable entering into these long-term commitments like a mortgage on a home. Now, speculation can also enter into the housing sector. We certainly saw it at the end over the whole housing bubble that burst in the U.S. between 2007 2008. So the idea there was, the speculation was, well, housing prices are going to go up forever. I might as well buy one now on very favorable terms, hold it for a while, and sell it. So the important part is that speculation added to the demand for housing, house construction, drove prices up, etc. Now, demographics can also affect the housing market, and we talk about something called household formation. So we're thinking of young people, right? Although those ages may be getting higher. I think it used to be 19 to 25 is when we think of people getting married, having kids, wanting to get a house for the first time. And so this would drive housing demand and new home construction to some extent. And we can also have not only age demographics, but geographical shifts in population density. So we can have a really hot housing market in a town like Atlanta, where people are moving there, people were moving south, jobs there, economy growing. So it doesn't have to be economy-wide. We can also have regional differences in housing activity. The other area we want to look at here is the external trade sector. Now, imports are determined by domestic incomes. So incomes are going to be cyclical with the business cycles in the domestic economy. When incomes are higher, people are consuming more, they're buying more imports. Now, export demand, on the other hand, is going to be run by business cycles in the foreign countries, which may be independent of the domestic business cycle or may not. But anyway, when we have higher incomes and higher economic growth in foreign countries, then the export demand is high. So the export demand is going to go with the business cycles in the foreign countries, the import demand going to move more closely to the business cycle in the domestic economy. Now, both imports and exports are going to be influenced by currency exchange rates. We'll talk more about this when we get into international econ, but you should be familiar with this concept of a currency appreciating. So if the price of a euro was $1.30 US per euro, an appreciation of the US currency would be if this price went down to 128 per euro, for example. Okay. So what does that do to the prices of imports and exports? Well, from the U.S. standpoint, the domestic currency is appreciated, so that's going to increase the import demand because euro-priced goods are now cheaper in U.S. dollars because the currency appreciated. On the other hand, it's going to take more euros to buy goods with a given dollar price because the euro is depreciated relative to the dollar. And so export demand will fall. Now, with a currency depreciation, we get just the opposite effect. Imports become more expensive, demand goes down, or at least the quantity demanded goes down, and exports, when your currency depreciates, increase in cost to increase demand because the cost to foreigners has decreased. Okay, as promised, here we go, business cycle theories. Got 2 slides on this. Now, how much you need to know about this for the exam, I don't know. The learning outcome statement, I think we've got it here. Yeah, it just says, describe the theories of the business cycle. So how much description? Well, I think if you can get what's on these slides, you've got a chance. It's only 1 LOS. So let's go through these. Neoclassical. Now remember, the classical economists say that, well, we're going to get back to full employment. Just leave things alone. Wages and other input prices will adjust, bringing us back to full employment if we get temporarily into a recession or temporarily in an expansion where we have over full employment. Now, the causes of the business cycle, according to the neoclassical economists, are changes in technology. The technology increases over time, but sometimes very rapidly, sometimes slowly. We've got a population and an economy that's growing over time, and these differences in the rates of change of technology are what cause business cycles, according to this school of thought. What's the recommended policy? Well, as I said, like the classical economists, allow wages, prices of other inputs to adjust, and that'll bring us back to equilibrium. Now, Keynes wrote after the Great Depression in the U.S., and the idea was, well, how come we had this long depression? If, as the classical and neoclassical economists told us, that we're going to fairly rapidly return to full employment equilibrium, it just didn't happen. So Keynes' thought was that the reason was these input prices were downward sticky. And so that's why we were stuck in this Great Depression. Business expectations were poor, and the contractions were persisting because wages were downward sticky, and possibly some other input prices, although that's what we add here to make it New Keynesian. So these two, very much alike, except Keynes said wages are downward sticky. New Keynesian said not only wages, but other important inputs such as energy may have downward sticky prices, not my language, as well. So what's the prescription? Well, Keynes said use fiscal and or monetary policy to restore full employment. So either increasing the federal budget deficit or printing money, expanding the money supply to drive interest rates down and spur more economic activity is the prescription of Keynesians. Now, monetarists, well, this is, I hope, easy to remember. Monetarists are all about money. That's why they call them that. So what's the causes of the business cycle according to monetarists? Inappropriate money supply. Inappropriate changes in the money supply growth rate. And what's the recommended policy? Well, the monetarists say if we had a steady, predictable growth of the money supply, if it's growing just slightly faster than the output of the whole economy, then we're not going to have these business cycles, or at least not to the extent. Now, the Austrian school of economic thought says that government intervention in the economy is what messes everything up and causes business cycles. So the recommended policy is pretty straightforward. Just don't mess with it and don't force interest rates to artificially low levels, driving these peaks, because then they're going to be followed by a correction into a recession after that. The last business cycle theory that we have to look at is new classical, which is sometimes called real business cycle theories. Real meaning it's not just a monetary phenomenon, but it's a real economic phenomenon. So these business cycles are really rational responses to external shocks and technology changes. So the recommended policy from the new classical school of economic thought is don't intervene to counteract business cycles. So this is don't intervene. This is just the opposite of Keynes here. And so we've got the monetarist, the Keynesian, the neoclassical, and the new classical. So if you can keep those relatively straight, you should be in good shape for a question on this. After all, it's only one learning outcome statement out of the 564-page econ book from the CFA Institute. Well, now to talk about unemployment, which we often hear about unemployment rates and different statistics associated with employment, let's get our terms straight here, and then we'll understand a little better how these statistics vary over the business cycle. First off is frictional unemployment. Unemployment results because of the time it takes employers and employees to find each other. So for frictional unemployment, we have employees that are qualified for the jobs. We have employers looking to fill the jobs, but they have to search and find each other and match up. So this takes some time. Now, you can think of this, one way to remember this is frictional unemployment is if you have some friction with your boss and tell him you just can't stand working for him one more day and you leave, that's frictional unemployment. Because there's another job out there, hopefully with a better boss, and you're going to take some time to search and find it, and they'll take some time to search and find you. Now, with structural unemployment, on the other hand, there's changes in the economy. So when the textile industry in the Carolinas, for example, a lot of that production moved overseas over a period of time. So you had a lot of trained and skilled textile workers down there, but the textile industry was shrinking and there weren't jobs that matched up with their skill set. So the industries that were growing were healthcare, technology, information technology, computers, that was growing. So there was a mismatch between the skills and the jobs. So this is structural unemployment, and that is going to be remedied as the workers gained the new skills to fill the jobs where they were needed. Now, frictional and structural unemployment are always positive. They're always with us. So unemployment is not going to go to zero. In fact, we take frictional and structural to be the level of unemployment consistent with full employment. Now, cyclical unemployment, on the other hand, results from the phases of the business cycle. So during expansions, especially near the peaks, we may be at over full employment. That is, cyclical unemployment might be -3. Frictional and structural may be +5 for a net 3% reported unemployment rate. So cyclical unemployment is 0 when we're at full employment, but full employment may be consistent with 5%, 4% unemployment based on frictional and structural unemployment. So, some more terms and definitions, I think, here. When we talk about this unemployment rate, to be unemployed, a person must be available for work and actively looking for work. The labor force is all those who are employed and all those who are unemployed. So when we calculate this unemployment rate, we're going to take the number employed, unemployed, over employed plus unemployed, the labor force, and that's our unemployment rate. Note that when we have a discouraged worker, the economy's bad, they've just quit looking for work, they're no longer counted in the labor force. Excuse me. Now, what is the labor participation ratio? Well, that's this whole labor force, unemployed plus employed, as a percentage of the working age population. So what percentage of the working age population is actively seeking work or currently employed? So this changes over time, maybe not real rapidly, but we've seen some big changes in this, especially as women entered the workforce post-World War II. And although they were counted as part of the working age population, they weren't necessarily in the labor force, certainly not in the numbers that they are now. I mentioned discouraged workers, so they're available for work if you came and knocked on the door, called them on the phone, or sent them an email, but they're not currently seeking employment, so they're not in the labor force. Okay, some more terms. Inflation. Well, inflation is not just a one-shot change in the price level, right? If when OPEC came together and raised oil prices, well, that led to an increase in oil prices, but as we know, People are paying more for oil and energy. They've got less money to spend on other things, so there'll be some other adjustments. That's not necessarily inflation. We want to define inflation as a persistent increase in the price level over time. And the inflation rate is just that increase in the price level over a period of, say, 1 year. And we'll take a look at how we measure that, or a couple of ways that inflation is measured in just a minute. Disinflation, don't get confused between disinflation and deflation. Deflation is a negative rate of inflation. The overall price level is actually showing a persistent decrease. And central bankers, economists, don't like deflation. They want to avoid that. But if inflation's high, need to bring it down, then that's disinflation. Disinflation, just a decrease in the positive rate of inflation. And hyperinflation, just out of control, high inflation. Countries historically, some have run inflation rates of 20, 30, 100% a year. Those certainly all are classified as periods of hyperinflation. So how are we going to measure inflation? Well, we're going to use a price index, and we can have a weighted average of goods and services prices, and we're going to compare these to a base period. And that's going to be our proxy for the change in the overall price level. Now, one of the most used indexes is the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. And this measures the cost of a fixed basket of goods. So we look at a point in time, say 1980. And we look at this basket of goods and we say, okay, at current 1980 prices, what is this basket of goods, which is some housing and some transportation and some energy and some food and some clothing and some leisure activities as well, I imagine, and figure out what that bundle of goods or basket of goods costs. And then we look out to, say it's now 1990, oh, slip another 9 in there. Now it's 1990, 10 years later. We take that same basket of goods and put 1990 prices on everything and say, what does the basket cost now? So that's how this CPI is calculated. You can look at an example here. So find the cost of the basket of goods in the base period, then find the cost of the same goods, same amount, same basket in the current period. And then take the ratio of those, and because it's an index, we multiply it by 100. So what's going on here, the price of that basket in the base year was $2,500. Now it's $2,900. So that's an increase of 16%, right? So this is 1.16, this ratio. But we multiply it by 100 to turn it into an index number. So if I tell you that the base period was 1992, and we said now the CPI is this, that would mean that prices were up 16% since the base period of 1992. And that would be our estimate of compound inflation over that period. Seems a little low, but it'll do for our example here. Now, the CFA curriculum mentions a price index for personal consumption expenditures, which are based not on purchase prices, but surveys of businesses instead of consumers and business pricing decisions. I don't see that as much as I see the CPI, that's for sure. And probably not as much as I see these other two. We've got the GDP deflator. We had talked about that earlier. So if our base year, we've got a base year, say it was 1990, and we say the GDP deflator is 126, we would use that the same way we could the CPI. We're going to take nominal GDP for this year and divide it by not 126, but 1 plus 26%. Divide by 1.26. And we would do that to turn nominal GDP into real GDP relative to the base year. Now, the producer price index just doesn't look at finished goods, right? It looks at crude materials, intermediate goods, parts that are made that go into jet engines, as well as finished good prices. So this may lead the consumer price index a little bit, because when producer prices are going up, that's going to, at least with a little bit of a lag, translate into higher retail and consumer prices. So the producer price index, or PPI, is often taken to be a little bit of a leading indication of changes in the consumer price index, or CPI. Now, we want to differentiate here between headline inflation. Headline inflation is what I just described, okay? That's CPI that includes essentially all goods and services, or at least a representative bundle of goods and services for consumers, and we'll call that headline inflation. But core inflation excludes two volatile components from that, and that is food. Food prices bounce around quite a bit, and energy, especially oil prices, bounce around quite a bit as well. And so a lot of times central banks, when they're targeting an inflation rate, they take out food and energy from this basket and then compare it over time, because they don't want these transitory components to indicate a trend where there's no real trend, where it's just noise or random fluctuations around a trend line. So they look at core inflation. For the purposes of the exam, understand that core inflation is just basket of goods minus food and energy, and the reason we take those out is because they're volatile. We think we get better indications of trends and changes in trends from looking at core inflation. Okay, what are some of the limitations of our inflation measures? Well, the CPI is widely believed, especially according to the curriculum, to overstate the true rate of inflation. So you should know that for sure. The bias of the CPI, we think, is upward. Well, why is this upward bias? Well, one thing is substitution of lower-priced products for higher-priced products. If the price of beef goes up, consumers may shift to pork, they may shift to chicken, they may shift to tofu, for all I know. But they're going to change their consumption patterns to reflect changes in relative prices. Well, remember, the CPI is calculated with a basket that's fixed at the base period. So while consumers have the opportunity to change their consumption patterns in response to changes in the relative prices of goods, we don't allow that in the CPI. So we're ignoring those substitution effects. That's one reason we think the CPI is biased upward. Now, new goods replace older, lower-priced goods, and in a similar idea, there's price increases due to quality improvements. If you look at the prices of cars over time, cars are quite different than when I grew up. One, they continue to run for a very long time. They need little or no maintenance, and they have airbags. They drive better. Okay. As I mentioned, better longevity, and certainly other things that we could talk about as well in terms of improvements. Well, there's no adjustment for this in the CPI. A car is a car. The iPod may have replaced the cheaper, what was that thing, Sony Walkman, okay, but something like that wouldn't be included in there. It would just be a continuation of that type of good, but with the higher prices. So this is some of the arguments or explanations of why we believe the CPI overstates inflation. So what can we do about that? Well, now this CPI with that fixed bundle, that bundle fixed in the base period, that's a L'Esper's index. A Posh index allows the basket weights to vary, and what we do in calculating a Posh index instead of a L'Esper's index is we use the basket weights from the current period. Okay? So we've got a little bit of substitution going on there. So that's a Posh index. Know that difference. Okay? CPI, same bundle of goods priced every year. The POSH index, every year we get a new bundle of goods, and we compare the cost of that bundle of goods in the current year, the current consumption patterns, to what that would have cost in the base period. So potentially pretty decent or significant difference there. Now, third term here, chained price index. Now, they don't make that too difficult in the curriculum. And in fact, the example they give is just a Fisher index, which is a geometric mean of a L'Esper's and a POSH index. So I guess you're either taking what's good from both of them or a little of what's bad from both of them. But anyway, the story here is that reduces this bias from not allowing substitutions in the consumption bundles in response to changes in relative prices. Okay, factors that affect price levels. Well, we're going to talk about two types of inflation here. But the two types is just what trips off inflation. Please understand that over time, it's increases in the money supply that drive inflation. The association between money supply growth and inflation over long periods is pretty clear and pretty strong. Over short periods, not so much. We may have periods where the money supply is growing rapidly, in which we don't have too much inflation, but it may come back later on as inflation. So the difference between cost push or wage push inflation and demand pull inflation is how it starts out. With cost push inflation, we're going to start with an increase in wages or the increase in the price of some important input into the productive process. So we'll start from equilibrium here using our long-run aggregate supply. Remember, this is our level of full employment. Cyclical employment is 0. We're at equilibrium. Here's our aggregate demand curve and our short-run aggregate supply curve. Recall that the short-run aggregate supply curve is drawn holding input prices constant. And it says, well, the price level here, when output prices are higher, businesses are willing to supply a greater amount of goods and services, assuming that input prices stay the same. So let me clear up that and run some of the animation here. So how do we start out? Well, we start out, if we have an increase in a real resource price, like a spike in the price of oil, okay, that's an increase in an input price. That moves our short-run aggregate supply curve. And now we find ourselves in a disequilibrium situation. We are lower than full employment. Cyclical unemployment is up. Well, what happens now? Well, we can just wait for prices to adjust, for other input prices to adjust. But that may be a long and painful process. More likely, the government's going to step in and stimulate aggregate demand along this kind of Keynesian idea of, well, we should stimulate aggregate demand either with fiscal or monetary policy. Now, without any government intervention, we may persist in this disequilibrium, below full employment situation for a while, longer than people would like. And here we have positive increase in the price level, but we also have a decrease in economic activity below full employment. And that's what we call stagflation. I think we've got a slide on that in a minute, but that's the idea. A stagnating economy, but with inflation. See, usually we associate inflation with a high level of economic activity, with the end of an expansion and coming into a peak. And that's often when inflation rises, the monetary authorities cut back the money supply to reduce inflation, and that leads us into a contraction and maybe a recession. So stagflation, stagnant economy with inflation. Okay, so when the government decides to stimulate aggregate demand and get us back to full employment, back to long-run equilibrium, you see that causes even a further increase in price levels. So this cost-push inflation has two pieces. Input prices, costs or wages, jump up. This decreases short-run aggregate supply, puts us at below full employment levels, causing the government to step in with either fiscal or monetary policy to increase aggregate demand, get us back to full employment, but at the cost of further increases in the price level. And this could also turn into a cycle or a circle if oil producers said, well, dollars just aren't as worth as much anymore. We've got to raise the price of oil again. If the government has the same response, you can see how this can lead to a prolonged period of cost-push inflation. Now, our other type of inflation here is demand pull. And in this case, we start out at full employment, but aggregate demand is stimulated anyway. So monetary authorities or the Congress, the governing bodies have stepped in and somehow increased aggregate demand to above full employment levels. Well, it's often handy to think of real economic variables, production, how much stuff is produced, things like this, and money variables. Because clearly, if every dollar was worth 1/2 of what it is now, but we all had twice as many and the prices were all twice as high, we'd have essentially the same economy. But in this case, if we've expanded the money supply, or even through fiscal policy tried to get the economy to run at over full employment, it's just not sustainable. That's what we mean by over full employment. People are not willing to work for those wages, that much money forever. It's a temporary phenomenon, another disequilibrium situation. Well, as we move into this above full employment, that causes competition for employees and resources for production, which is going to drive those input prices up. And what happens when input prices go up? That short-run aggregate supply curve is going to decrease in response to those input price increases and move us along the aggregate demand curve back to a sustainable equilibrium. Okay? But again, the net effect is just an increase in the price level. Now, we'll look at this again when we look at monetary and fiscal policy using the same aggregate demand, long-run aggregate supply graphs to illustrate what's going on. Here we just want to draw the distinction between demand pull, started with an increase in aggregate demand for whatever reason, or cost push, it started with an increase in input prices, which took us below full employment. So make sure you can make that distinction. And later on, what we're going to try and drive home is this idea of, well, if we started full employment, what happens if we stimulate aggregate demand? Well, in the short run, production does increase and prices go up. In the long run, prices go up again, but we're right back to our long-run full employment GDP. Sometimes we call that potential GDP as well. Okay, another term for you here, NAIRU or some darn thing, the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. Just a definition you need to know, it's the lowest unemployment rate that will not induce wage push inflation. So it's the lowest unemployment rate, and it's very tempting to call this the full employment level. The curriculum makes a distinction there and says it's not necessarily the same as full employment or cyclical unemployment equals zero, because wage pressure may be in economic segments. So if we have a shortage of workers in technology, information technology, computer systems, and healthcare, then there may be wage pressure there even at a full employment level across the economy. A minor point, but I just want to emphasize because I know it's natural to look at that definition of the natural rate of unemployment and say that's the full employment rate. Well, very similar ideas, but a little bit of a distinction as we look at pockets of worker shortage and wage pressures. Friedman also had this NARU, the natural rate of unemployment. Excuse me. Oh, good. We've gotten to leading indicators. Now, in all honesty, a lot of the stuff I read refers to these as misleading indicators, but we need to know what they are and how they're used, so let's take a look at it, and I'll take my little misleading away from there. So the idea here is we've got all these statistics. You know, we generate so much statistical information about the economy. What's it telling us, and what are the things that we should be looking at? Well, we want to divide these statistics into leading indicators, lagging indicators, and coincident indicators. And the difference is whether the peaks or troughs in these indicators are at the same times as the peaks and troughs in the economy, in the business cycle, or whether the peak in this statistic lags the peak in the economy, or whether it leads it. Well, leading indicators give us some view into the future, so that's a good thing. That would be nice to have. But at the same time, what we're trying to get to here is looking at a broad array of indicators and saying, well, the preponderance tells us we're in this stage of the economic cycle. We'll see how that works in just a minute. Let's highlight some of these leading indicators. Now, I don't expect you to memorize all of these. I haven't memorized all of these. But here for leading indicators, we want to know, well, which ones are going to change before the economy changes? So a pickup in building permits, that's going to lead the changes in economic activity. I picked that one first because it's got some sense to it, and it's easy to understand. Okay? Weekly hours in manufacturing. Those weekly hours going up is a leading indicator, because when we look at hours rather than employment, which we're going to look at in a minute, but when we look at weekly manufacturing hours, we've got some overtime, or even what had been a 34-hour work week now becomes a full work week of 40 hours. They haven't done any hiring. This hasn't really changed anything about the number employed, but it's an indication that orders have picked up, that they're operating more intensively, and that it can be an indicator of further expansion in the economy. Stock prices. Well, it'd be nice if we could look at the economy and forecast future stock prices. It turns out stock prices are trying to forecast the future of the economy, so that becomes a leading indicator. Flattening of the yield curve also becomes a leading indicator, as does an increase in the money supply. So an increase in the money supply can be an indication of falling interest rates in the future, which will spur economic activity. So that's one reason it might be a leading indicator. And consumer expectations are surveyed at least monthly, and when expectations of the future are better, I guess they're usually right, because this is a leading indicator. And on the way down, when consumer expectations turn poor, it's a leading indicator of contraction or possibly a recession. Now let's look at some coincident indicators. Turning points in these tend to coincide with business cycle peaks and troughs. So, non-farm payrolls. Number of people hired in non-farm employment that are reported as being on the payroll. This seems to go with the economic cycles. Personal incomes. Well, that makes sense. If the number of people on payrolls, personal income increases along with that. So less transfer payments from the government, but those are two coincident. The level of industrial production and manufacturing and trade sales in the productive process. These all tend to match up with the business cycle. And then we have our lagging indicators. Now, the unemployment rate is a lagging indicator. And the reason for that has to do with these discouraged workers, right? We're at the bottom of a recession, right? We're just starting into an expansion. Remember, I said employers are slow to hire new full-time workers. So there's a little bit of a lag there as we said we increased our intensity of use of both labor and capital. At the same time, discouraged workers now see more hope out there, so they get out there and start looking for jobs. Now they're part of the unemployed. So the unemployment rate can't even increase. And then when it finally comes down in response to an expanding economy, it's later on. So that's a lagging indicator, as is the duration of unemployment. When discouraged workers come back into the labor force, start looking for work, well, now they've got a short duration of unemployment, and that will get longer over a period at the beginning of an expansion. Inventory sales ratio, we talked about that as being a lagging indicator, and commercial and industrial loans, the prime rate, and consumer credit as a percentage of income. That's going to turn with a lag, both on the upside and on the downside. Now, I know these are a lot to remember. Let's take a look at the learning outcome statement. Okay. It says we need to know the past, current, or expected future business cycle phase of an economy based on economic indicators. Well, let's take a look at something like that, at least what it might look like, and try and make some sense out of it. So here you're given these, 5 economic indicators. Payroll employment is increasing. So number of people on payrolls is increasing. What was that? Well, I think that was a coincident indicator. I think manufacturers' new orders were a leading indicator, right? Orders come before the production and the jobs and the paychecks. The prime rate, I think we saw as a lagging indicator, as well as the inventory sales ratios. And the yield curve is flattening. And I think that was a leading indicator, along with the money supply, right? Let's see if we've got, those are our lagging indicators. That's a coincident indicator. And those are leading indicators. Now, one thing about writing test questions, you really can't put 3 of them in one direction and 2 in the other and say, well, 3 beats 2. So if you get a question like this, it's more likely than not that there would be a number of them suggesting the same phase of the business cycle. So if we've got payroll employment is increasing and it's a coincident indicator, then I'm thinking we might be in an expansion phase near the peak. So that's what you might run up against. Good luck with that. But try and remember a few of these. And the thing is, and the way I do it, is try and tell myself a story that makes sense out of it. So it's pretty easy with some of these, like, well, building permits and factory orders precede the actual activity. But beyond that, some of those stories are a little bit harder to tell, but just remember about the lagged effects in both hiring and business investment in new productive assets, new equipment on the way up, and slow. They don't sell off that equipment when they fear we're headed into a contraction, and they try not to lay off full-time employees. But when we know we're in a contraction and it's really been confirmed, we'll see some layoffs, some increase in unemployment with a lag at that point. So that's it for business cycles. Hope that did you some good. Good luck in your studies.